City Club's Friday Forum this afternoon. I'm Corleen Kraft, President, and it's nice to see all of you here. Our program today is featuring David Bragdon, who's the President of Metro Council, and his title, Past the Turning Point, New Thinking for a New Era. Our titles are really good. Wait till you hear our next one, too. Now, if you would be so kind as to turn off your cell phones and alarms and anything else that might cause terrible distress up here. And then I will tell you about our next Friday forum with Representative Peter DeFazio. Now listen to this title, Retirement, Roads, and Market-Based Rates, Life Under the Hammer and Hastert. Did you get it? Life Under the Hammer and Hastert, as in Dennis, who usually sits right back here. So that will be Peter DeFazio next week. Should be very interesting. And just a note, as if many of you haven't heard it, but just to pound the point home, we are having our annual membership drive. And anyone who is not yet a member, we welcome you with open arms. And we have our final Friday, which is our Friday afternoon get-together over here, the last Friday of every month, at our City Club Commons, which is on 9th and Washington. And for anyone who joins today, if you are old enough, you can have a drink ticket for the beverage of your choice. So if that isn't incentive, I don't know what is. And also it's your last chance to be entered into a drawing for a memorabilia package that was donated by Tom Lauderdale. And if any of you know Tom, you know it will be really interesting because Tom is so interesting. So this is your last chance for that drawing, so please join today. Now, I've already mentioned tonight's final Friday, and it will be over here at the City Club Commons off at 4:30 to 6 p.m. Just get together, just chat with people. If you're considering becoming a member or if you're a new member, please come and join us. It's just a casual get-together, and it's pretty much fun. Also coming up next week at the City Club is our book club, and it will be held on March 28th. And it's entitled Citizens Read. The book this month was The Portland Edge. Then we're also involved in partnering with the Illahee presentations, and Jane Holtz Kay's presentation will be on March 30th, and the title is Last Chance Landscaping. Sorry, wrong. Last Chance Landscape, Depaving and Replanning Cities. Followed by the next post-Illahee lecture discussion on March 31st at our City Club Commons. And the post-lecture discussion will be moderated by Metro Councilor and Deputy President Rex Burkholder. Now, details on all of these events can be found in the brochures and on the website at pdxcityclub.org. You can also buy audio or videotapes of this program, and I think that that's about all you can do unless you want to get in and blog on the website. So it's all available for showing to your friends. I would like to very much thank our sponsors this quarter, without whom these broadcasts could not be possible because they underwrite them. And for this quarter, they're Pope & Talbot Incorporated, Providence Health Systems, and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca. Thank you very much, sponsors. Now I'd like to get on to our program with David Bragdon. He became the Metro Council's first regionally elected president on January 6th. He was first elected to the Metro Council in 1998, and he was the presiding officer in 2000 and 2001. But prior to his service on the Metro Council, he developed expertise in transportation issues in the private sector as a senior executive at Nike, at Lasco Shipping, and at Evergreen Airlines. Whole host of different kinds of transportation issues, I see. Then he worked for 5 years as the Port of Portland's marketing manager just prior to that. So he's had extensive experience after he finished his honors degree in government at Harvard University. So please help me welcome David Bragdon.
Well, thank you, Corleen. I actually took office in January of 2003. So this is the third time I've had the opportunity to address the club. These actually are relatively exclusive events. In terms of the press coverage, just because of the way we tend to time things, the first of these addresses I got to give, the president chose to invade Iraq the day before. So the coverage of this speech ended up someplace in the automotive section. And Last year, I think it was Mount St. Helens that knocked us back into the sports page. So if you leave the hotel today and you see a plague of locusts or some other newsworthy event, do not tell the Oregonian about it. I'd love to get some coverage. Actually, it is a pleasure to be back here for the third time. And just to refresh, 2 years ago, right after I'd taken office, I addressed the club and promised you that we were going to be undertaking some reforms at Metro internally. And I told you a little bit about how we'd be implementing the charter change the structure of our organization due to a ballot measure that had passed in 2000, which created the post that I have, the first time that we've had a regionally elected official on the Metro Council, a change that was proposed by the last executive officer, Mike Burton, very visionary change. And I described to you at that time some of the changes that we were going to take. A year ago, then, I was back in front of you, and I talked about some of the reforms that we were undertaking externally in terms of how we're relating to people outside, and also how we're approaching our jobs. And I suggested at that time that a lot of the tools that we'd used in Oregon's planning system for the first 30 years, while they had accomplished a lot of very, very positive things, that they also needed to evolve and adapt for the next 30 years. And I said to you, we really need to advance from an era of planning into an era of investment and a transition from a reliance on regulation alone, but to a wider set of tools. So now this is the third noontime that I get to spend with you, and it's more important than ever that I describe to you and ask for your help in fulfilling those promises that I talked about 2 years ago and a year ago. Some of those changes have been controversial, but as controversial as they might be to people who may have become complacent about how we used to operate in the region, I think the events of the last year, the past 12 months, a variety of events, demonstrate really that change was overdue and that change needs to continue. And whether we talk about Measure 37 or continuing lagging economic conditions here in the region or approaches to conserving the natural resources in this area, every one of those topics over the last 12 months, every one of them has a common lesson for us. And I think the lesson is that if we fail to adapt and we fail to take things into our own hands, we do run the risk that the change that will be brought upon us, either by unmediated public opinion or either through circumstance, those sorts of changes may be more drastic and a lot more negative than the positive change that we can create ourselves. So here is what I've been doing and my 6 colleagues have been doing on the Metro Council to create that kind of positive change. First, the changes that I talked about that first year, the changes at the Metro Council itself and how those have played out over the last 4 years. The first time that I stood before you in this job, I promised some internal reforms that were consistent with the new structure that we have to make us more well-managed and inclusive and fiscally disciplined in the way that I think Mike Burton intended when he put forward the visionary ballot measure to change the structure. There again, I want to give a lot of credit to my predecessors at this agency, including an executive officer who recognized the limitations of the position and, having served in it very admirably, proposed changes to make things better. And I think those have played out very well. But at the time that I took office, the agency, we'd been balancing the budget, and I had been there on the council for part of this, not able to really participate fully in the way that we do now. We'd been balancing the budget for many years by dipping into reserves in an unsustainable fiscal pattern. Overhead, which particularly personal services, and a lot of this relates to PERS, was increasing much faster than inflation, again, on an unsustainable basis. We had also, the Metro had just had its bond rating reduced because we'd violated the bond covenants on our solid waste transfer stations. Now, just for context, I mean, these are revenue bonds on solid waste facilities, and losing your revenue bond rating on that is somewhat like going broke, having a monopoly selling water in the desert. I mean, you really have to slip up to do that. Well, I made some changes in personnel, some big changes in how we budget, and changes in expectations. And my 6 colleagues on the council joined me in making those changes. The first time that I spoke to you, I announced that very same week that I'd be appointing Mike Jordan, who was then chair of the Clackamas County Commission, to be the first chief operating officer for our agency and to fulfill that role that Mike Burton had foreseen as necessary. That for the first time, our agency would be managed by a professional manager who was responsible to the council rather than being managed by a rival political figure who was separated from the council, didn't even really have a veto or be able to participate with the council. At the same time, I said, I think this might go a little bit better if I appoint a chief operating officer and our relationships with local governments might improve, appointing somebody who's drawn from the ranks of local government itself, somebody who speaks the language with our first constituency in local government. Well, in the 2 years since then, Mike has infused our management team with discipline and with competence. There are new faces there on the management team as well as old faces on the senior management team, but they're people with the capacity and the will to perform. They're people who are unlocking the potential and the ambitions of our talented employees, many of them who are very hungry for change and ready for new challenges as well. On the fiscal front, with the council's consent, and I'd also say with the council's courage, because these are tough votes to cast when you're casting votes that deal with people's jobs and budgets and popular programs. But with the council's courage, we made real strides fiscally. For the first time, my first budget was the first Metro budget in many years that did not dip into reserves. We cut some of those overhead costs, we increased some fees, and we trimmed programs, and we saved money for the ratepayer and the taxpayer. Last year, in my second budget, we stayed the course with that, emphasizing cost containment within our own operations and cutting some non-core programs. Again, not an easy thing to do. And we started taking better care and maintaining the public assets that are entrusted to us, like the convention center and the 8,500 acres of land that was purchased with the bond measure from 1995. Next 2 weeks, I'll be introducing my third budget. And for this one, we've initiated a strategic budgeting initiative that really enables us for the first time to focus on outcomes and results rather than simply perpetuate the status quo that you normally get generated by a continuous service line type of budget. We're undertaking a major internal reorganization. We've empowered Mike Jordan, our COO, to do that, to consolidate overlapping overhead functions that we have. He's initiated a hiring freeze, also a voluntary separation program so that we can accelerate attrition and reduce expenses. Very important. Well, with a tremendous new management team like that, some of the existing staff who are eager for change, and I think today the best Metro Council that we've ever had, I'm delivering on that promise that was proposed by the new structure, which was to reform and improve an agency that really needed to live up to its initial promise. And I want to pause again and stress the other 6 people who work with me in addition to Mike Jordan. Vernon Lefty Gomez, who was an ace for the New York Yankees, fellow southpaw with me, was asked why he was successful in his job, and he said he attributed it all to clean living and a fast outfield. Now, if you know anything about my taste in cuisine or my musical taste, you probably wouldn't say it's very credible that clean living may not be a claim I would make in terms of some of the restaurants that I tend to like around town. But I do have a very fast outfield. The 6 other counselors that work with me are tremendous, and going to work with them on all these things is really a tremendous thing. But the 7 of us also knew that once we started to reform things within Metro, then we could also move on to reforming things outside and how we engage with the outside and changing the way we do business across the whole region. So last year, in my sophomore year speech to you, I argued on some of those outside issues, and that said that if we were going to fulfill really the promise of Oregon life that we all treasure here, the things that bring us here, that keep us here, then we really needed to restock the planning and land use and regulatory toolkit that had really served very adequately from 1970 through the 1990s, but that we needed to supplement that and update it. And I also suggested at that time, that was back in February of 2004, that if we didn't change, we would continue a steady decline into complacency, or we would have change thrust upon us. Well, I mean, we may one day be thankful, actually, it turned out to be the latter rather than the former. But the day of reckoning came, in part on Election Day, in part because the day of reckoning was overdue. Even before the passage of Measure 37, in my talk with you and other places around the region, I was saying we need to link planning to investment. And I argued that those aspirations that we have for the revitalization of town centers around the region and have the type of revival that Gresham and Lake Oswego and other places are having in their downtowns, or to improve our parks network where we have allowed our investment to languish, or in terms of protecting the natural resources or reviving the economic vitality of the region, those aspirations would go unfulfilled if they were only based on abstract plans drawn up by government or regulations drawn up by government in isolation, that we weren't going to get there the way we were going. And I said a year ago, if the past had been about urban containment and an implicit sense that the reason that we have the system is to protect what's outside the urban growth boundary from something that's bad, cities, the future needs to be about urban transformation and making cities great places and focusing on what we have inside. As we were all getting tired of a planning system that seemed increasingly based on fighting the things we don't want instead of building the things that we do want. And all of that really came very clear to me one windy May morning, now nearly 10 months ago, at a memorial service for Ernie Bonner. And I bet a lot of you remember Ernie Bonner and worked with him to help make this city the great place that it is. And I learned a lot from Ernie during his life and career. People know he was on the Metro Council long before I was. And at his memorial service in Pioneer Courthouse Square, very appropriate place to have it, given his history, one of his colleagues from Cleveland, Ohio had come out to talk about him. And Ernie had worked in Cleveland, Ohio as the planning director in the 1960s before being brought to Portland to guide the Renaissance that occurred here. And his friend from Cleveland told a story that really made me see things in a new way. He said, for Ernie, the reason he'd gotten into the planning profession was about providing choices, and providing choices and opportunities for people who hadn't had them before. And I heard that in a new way, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and I think about it quite a bit. Because at some point, when you think about how planning was done and how our cities and suburbs developed in the 1950s and 60s, the work that Ernie ended up doing in the 60s and 70s was about creating more choices. Prior to thinking like that, we'd had a system where if you were this color, you lived over there, and if you were that color, you lived over there. And there was economic segregation, there was segregation, jobs are farther over there, houses are farther over there. There's only one way to get to and from work. There were fewer and fewer housing choices being offered, in large part because of government regulations that were actually restricting choices. And people like Ernie Bonner got into planning to provide more choices. And in looking back over the last 10 or 15 years, I realized to myself that at some point, and I don't know when it was. It was probably sometime in the 1990s. Planning, in people's minds anyway, became about restrictions rather than about choices. I don't know when that happened in the public consciousness, but I think that is the moment that we lost Measure 37. We didn't lose Measure 37 in November of 2004. We lost Measure 37 when planning became more about restrictions than about choices. So when I think about Ernie and the lessons that I take to work every day that he and others taught me, there are two. One was the one that I told you about last year, where it's about investment, it's not about planning. But the second one was that one that had been brought home at his memorial service, which was it's about giving people choices and opportunities to fulfill their potential. And that the assumption behind that is that well-motivated and well-informed people, particularly in a community like this, will make the right choices when they're given the right choices. So those are the lessons that I'm trying to put to work in my job. I'm trying to put those to work in two particular areas right now, where I've been really urging my colleagues in the public sector and people in the private and nonprofit sector that we need to put these lessons to work in new ways of doing things. Not coincidentally, these two areas, I think, are two of our biggest challenges we face as a region. Challenge of economic opportunity across the region, and the challenge of protecting and improving the natural resources that we love about this region. Now, those are two things that can go together if they're approached in the right way. But let me talk about each of them separately. The past year certainly demonstrated some of the flaws in the way we've tried to deal with economics as a region, certainly from our standpoint. In short, we really haven't dealt with economics very well as a region, despite the fact that people in the private sector or in academia or in the real world all recognize that actually the competitive economic unit is the region. It's no longer cities or counties or states. It's transportation networks, workforce networks, and communities about the region. We talked about that last year when I was here. But the Metro Council's adventure, our little adventure last year and a half within our own little fragment of the economic universe, really demonstrates the limitations of dealing with interrelated issues, dealing with them in an isolated fashion. It doesn't work very well. And over the last several years, our council responded, and I think responded responsibly, to the demonstrated need for industrial land, for example, in this region. And last June, we took action to expand the urban growth boundary for industrial purposes. We took steps to protect existing industrial land from encroachment by offices and retail. And while that decision appears to have held up through virtually all the appeals, LCDC, LUBA, there'll be some of it probably going to the Court of Appeals, all of it seems to have satisfied the state law, checked all the boxes, and been largely upheld. Yet everybody who's been involved in it, most of all the 7 of us who actually made the decision, are left with a sour taste in our mouths, and none of us can point to any one industrial job that's either stayed in Oregon or come to Oregon as a result of our years of study and controversy. Well, why is that? Well, I think often the roots of an unsatisfactory answer or an unsatisfactory experience are because we've started to ask the wrong question. Now, there's no doubt there was a need for industrial land, and we did that piece of it. But we were also being asked implicitly in a lot of the testimony we heard to fix the economy by using the land use system, as if the urban growth boundary had somehow caused a national recession, to hear some people tell it. Well, we did our part. I think we did it responsibly, as allowed by law and by public opinion, by increasing the land supply. I think that was the right thing to do. I talked 2 years ago about, as we started into that, about the need for business like Beaverton Foods that has the type of business that we want to have here and had run out of room in Beaverton and needed a large lot to locate on. They're now still here in the region in Hillsborough, and I think that's the type of business that we want to keep. So we did the right things by law, but I think our decision-making was incomplete. And it was also not informed by anything other than a reading of those state statutes. You know, we had those statute books to keep us company as we talked, and we had periodic conjugal visits from lobbyists in the real estate industry. And we had these just dynamite evenings with 600 concerned citizens down in Wilsonville. That was a real blast, too. So we weren't exactly lonely, but we were, in a sense, locked in a vacuum. And our decisions about raw land, and raw land is not a substitute for economic vitality, our decisions about raw land were not linked to any larger vision. They weren't linked to any economic strategy. They weren't linked to any sort of community aspirations or any sense of where we wanted to be economically or as people. By law and by habit, the law and the state law, but also the habit of our decision-making, we weren't able to think about those investment strategies, the community aspirations, or marketplace factors as well. Well, we're now working constructively with the state legislature to change some of those laws. It's making some people nervous, but so far there's such widespread dissatisfaction. We're actually working with conservation advocacy groups as well as the development community to fix some of these things. For the time being, we have a breather in the urban growth boundary discussions. I think our attitude toward the urban growth boundary, speaking on behalf of the 7 of us, that as my 12-year-old nephew would say about the Blazer games, if you asked him to go, been there, done that, and we're not going to be doing that for a couple of years. We want to use that time to think about where we do want to go economically, because land development, which is what we've been forced to focus on, land development is not a surrogate for economic development, yet the system has led us to pretend that it is. As if speculative one-story office parks in one part of the region on the edge of the town, as if those create economic prosperity, when actually probably maybe the best they might do is move economic activity around the region. And if competing globally on the basis of cheap real estate were really what it's all about, as is often implied by the system and the types of decisions that we have to make, if cheap real estate were really what it's all about, you know, Mongolia and Lapland would have us beat every time. They'd be very prosperous places. Probably places like Singapore and the Netherlands would be destitute. Well, we know that's not true. We do know we do need to be competitive on the fundamentals, and cost is one of those fundamentals, but we should also know it's not just about being cheapest, whether it's cheap real estate, cheap utilities, or cheap workforce. Somebody else, whether it's Alabama or Mongolia, is always going to be able to beat us on that. And that's not what we want to aspire to. So how would we do better? How would we do better making those sorts of decisions at the Metro Council about land use matters? Well, I think we would do a whole lot better if we could link those decisions to an explicit economic strategy that relates to our community's aspirations and our strengths, whether it's our strategy of maintaining an urban growth boundary or our strategy of trying to revitalize brownfields and help have our town centers come back. An economic opportunity strategy would include those sorts of factors. It would also include the other factors that involve economic prosperity, the ability to move around, freight and goods, workforce, utility, the tax structure, and all of those other elements. Because that's the shame of this, is that there are big parts of the debate. While we've been gripped with the urban growth boundary up until last June, there are big parts of the debate that aren't really happening. And those in this region who are struggling to develop a higher education agenda for this region, they're having to struggle in isolation. Ditto for the people who are working on workforce training issues or the other things. People who are working on brownfields issues. They're not able to plug into something larger that would help us all make decisions. Those aren't Metro Council issues, and that's exactly my point. They are regional issues that we can be part of helping to solve, but that a lot of other people need to be solved. They don't belong to us. They don't belong to anybody. They belong really to all of us. But fortunately, I think there are people stepping up and organizations stepping up around this region right now, and we want to be part of it at Metro. The Portland Business Alliance, for example, some fresh new leadership there. They are undertaking a regional business plan for the region. We said, you know, there's got to be a chapter in that book that deals with freight mobility, which is something that we know something about at the Metro Council in terms of making our port competitive, in terms of making warehousing and distribution work. There's probably part of that business plan that needs to deal with the quality of life aspects of having a great parks network. Well, that's also something we want to participate in. And we're hearing people in the business community now saying, you know, that's right, and we want to have your participation in that. There is also an unprecedented degree of cooperation at the moment, and we need to seize this moment, among public sector leaders in this region. I was recently at a meeting at the Portland Development Commission that was chaired by Rob Drake, the mayor of Beaverton. Now, he is a regional thinker, but I want you to think about just the titles and think how rare this would have been 3 or 4 years ago. The mayor of Beaverton is chairing a meeting at the Portland Development Commission. Well, he's there because he recognizes, and the management of Portland Development Commission realizes that they're in it together, and Beaverton's health economically is tied to Portland. Martha Schrader, who's now chair of the Clackamas County Commission, she is also joining in these types of regional efforts. We have a mayor of Portland who is also reaching out to his peers in the public sector around the region and saying things publicly, saying Hillsborough's health's tied to downtown Portland's health. Very important step. All of us have to be part of that. Together, we could make a short list of the things that really count, because a regional business plan is not something you want to just put on the shelf. It's got to be a short list of things that we need to do. I don't know today what those are. I know something deals with higher ed agenda for this region, and they're smart people on that. I know transportation and freight mobility is part of that, and targeting our investment strategically. And I know for the work that we do in land use that the quality of life issues and nurturing the type of entrepreneurial environment that the creative class wants to have is also got to be part of our agenda. Joe Courtwright, who's an economist who did a lot of work for the West Side Economic Alliance, he's done work for the PBA, he's pointed out our region is second in the nation in attracting the 25 to 30-year-olds who are coming here with entrepreneurial activity, and they have college degrees, and they're here because they want to be here. One of those people, and we don't know who it is, one of those people is the next Howard Vollum, or the next Gun Denhart, or the next Phil Knight. And maybe right now, she's in her basement office in southeast Portland or in Aloha someplace working on something that hasn't been invented yet that we're all going to hear about 5 years from now. But they're here for a reason. They're here because, as I once heard Phil Knight say, well, we like living here. It's not because we have the widest freeways, it's because they like being here. They're here because we invest in neighborhoods and places that nurture that sort of entrepreneurship, including the whole quality of life that we have. We also have a disproportionate and very, very valuable manufacturing base that I think we want to keep, and we want to nurture that. Places like Gunderson and Intel, Freightliner, they are also not here because we're the cheapest place in the world, nor are they here because we might someday have a Major League Baseball stadium. They're here because of location and value. And we recently had one leave. Actually, somebody moved from Swan Island to Sweden. I point out, well, they're probably not moving for lower taxes, are they? They're probably moving for some other reason. It's the value. Again, cost is important, but our system has been driving it as the decisive factor that I don't think it is for the industries we want to target. For our part, what I would really like is for our decisions about land use to be made in that greater context, and not to be made on the basis of cheap real estate, or for that matter on the basis of some subparagraph 3, paragraph 9 of an administrative rule adopted by LCDC in 1975 as reinterpreted by LUBA in 1987 in a 3-part paragraph that was then upheld by the Court of Appeals in 1993 on remand. That's not the basis I want to be making decisions. I would like to make our decisions on behalf of a larger investment strategy for the region that keeps that next Howard Vollum here, that keeps Swan Island a good place for Freightliner, or keeps Hillsborough a good place for Intel. And I think this regional business plan that's being talked about would help guide us to that decision, those sorts of decisions, and it would help us set the stage for that transition I talked about a year ago, that transition from the era of planning to the era of investment, like the investment that's going on in downtown Gresham or other places, and those sorts of assessments. I hope we're all going to continue to coalesce around that effort, and we're all going to do our part. When I imagine what my part might be, I think about the mayor of Barcelona, which I would actually, given my taste in food, I would love to be mayor of Barcelona. But what I really like, having heard about him, this was a mayor who was elected, I believe, in the late 1970s, and he was a planner. Now think about that for a minute. A land use planner was elected mayor. And everybody thought, what's going to happen now? And actually, I think the planners were kind of excited about it. And he took office. His first act was, I hereby abolish the Department of Planning, and I establish the Department of Projects. And here are the first 10 projects. We're taking the plan off the shelf. Here are the first 10 projects. There was a waterfront revitalization project. There was a museum project. There was a water supply project. There was a city park project. And they did them. And then they came back and did 10 more. Ultimately, it resulted in the Olympics, and it resulted in a very economically vibrant places. I think that's the type of mentality that we'd like to have. There's a second arena where I have been in the forefront of reform and changes, and I think where we've had some abrupt lessons over the last year, and that is the area of natural resources. And I think a new approach there, which we're embarked upon, does require a leap of faith, and it requires a leap of thinking. And I think there are a lot of people in the region ready for that change too. Because the natural landscape is one of the things that we value the most around this region. And you ask people, if I asked everybody in this room, what do you like about living here? It might be a slightly different answer for each person, but I bet there's something green in your answer. Maybe it's just the view of Mount Hood when you leave your house, maybe it's Laurelhurst Park, maybe it's the Springwater Trail. It might be the ability to just enjoy your backyard and the outdoors there. But I bet for everybody here there's an element of green in why you like being here. And at times in our past, the community has really demonstrated that in a civic sense. Certainly 102 years ago when the Olmsteads were here and did the plan that resulted in a lot of what we're enjoying today. The 1995 bond measure that the Metro Council has used to purchase about 8,500 acres of green spaces, major steps forward. And I think we've also had an ethic of environmental regulation that's generally been very positive and important, statewide, city, and regionally. It's around this issue of regulation, I think, where the most controversy's been the past year. Let me tell you, I don't think there's anything wrong. I'm not anti-regulation. I think regulation is very important. And the fact that the lunch that you are now eating probably doesn't consist of tainted food is thanks to regulation. And the fact that if a fire were to break out here, there are enough sprinklers and there are emergency exits, that's also thanks to regulation. And the fact that you're not going to be prevented from getting a room at the Governor Hotel on the basis of your skin color, that is also thanks to regulation. But as all of these examples indicate, regulation is very good at preventing the worst from happening. Regulation by itself does not guarantee that good things do happen. And I think that's the stage where we are and need to be moving to. We have spent many years in our organization working on a regulatory program called Goal 5, again, one of those paragraphs from LCDC. The only problem with it was we were duplicating work that was done regionally, and we were imposing on a wide universe of people who felt that they had been criminalized by us. The ultimate problem of it was that through 8 years and lots of work, 0 acres, 0, had been protected by our efforts. We're now taking a different approach, and Van Jones, who's a civil rights leader in California, there's a tract circulating on the internet called The Death of Environmentalism, and the title's a little provocative because they're actually environmental advocates who wrote it. Van Jones says, the first wave of environmentalism, and here he's referring to Theodore Roosevelt, was framed around conservation, and the second around regulation. We believe the third wave will be framed around investment. Well, I tend to agree with that. One of my formative experiences on the Metro Council was with a gentleman named Walt Hitchcock. And Walt Hitchcock was one of 24 mayors in the region. He was mayor of Sherwood, very fast-growing, statistically the fastest-growing community in the state of Oregon. And I went out and talked to him about our efforts on protecting stream corridors. Well, it was a violent meeting. Not quite violent, but it was very heated. And they said, basically, we don't need you to tell us what to do. And I was sort of looking at him as, well, he's a suburban Republican, and, I'm, kind of different from that. So we must have nothing to talk about. But as he chased me out of town, he said, why don't you come back here during the day and we'll really have a talk? Well, I called him up the next day. I think he was surprised to hear from me. He said, well, what can I do for you? And I said, well, you invited me to come back. I'd like to do that and hear what's going on. Well, I went out there, and he said, well, I'm going to take you on a tour of what the city of Sherwood is doing in our way for the stream corridors that go through our city. So we were walking through these riparian corridors, and I mean, they were quite big. And I said, well, Mayor, how wide is this here? And he said, well, it's about 900 feet here. Down there, it's about 750 feet. And then it's not as important down there, so it's 150. And we wanted to put a school in over there, so it's 100, but the school participates in the stewardship. And I said, okay, wait a minute. I was here the other night, and you were apoplectic about 200-foot buffers, and now you're showing me 900-foot buffers. What's with that? And he said, well, we're not against 200-foot buffers. We were against you just telling us how we had to do it. He said, when you actually have the conversation, the differences are not all that great. What we're embarked on now is that type of spirit with our local government partners, but also the nonprofit sectors, with a program that we're going to be calling Nature in Neighborhoods. Let me outline a little bit about what that's about. First, there's the internal piece. As I said, we started on our internal reforms. Doing a strategic plan, we looked in the silos that used to exist within our own organization. There had been a lot of effort in the planning arena around this Goal 5 issue, and GIS and mapping and information about where resources are. Yet we had a different department on a different floor that was buying 8,500 acres of green space with real knowledge about how to restore and take care of those properties and deal with property owners. And in our solid waste department, which frankly that's where we hide all the money anyway, there was a natural gardening program to teach people about composting and reducing the waste stream and plant their gardens in a more habitat-friendly way. At the zoo, another of our departments, We have people doing world-renowned work on conservation of species, including the California condor, one of 3 places in the nation, which has attracted fantastic support from foundations all across the country who are donating to that. So here in these 4 or 5 different departments, we have people working on the natural environment. Said, all right, to our chief operating officer, take those department walls down, get those people together. It's all nature in the neighborhoods. And we want to put that together with the help of the community. We have a policy advisory committee. Half of them are here, actually. Jim Zarin, who I think has been very active in the club and wrote reports on this for the club, didn't you, Jim? Chaired that group in its first year. Mike Ragsdale is now chairing it. He's a former Metro councilor and state legislature and a developer out in Wilsonville. And there are several other members here. Esther Lev, Wetlands Conservancy, Mike Hout from Audubon, Dick Scouten from the Washington County Commission. And they are putting this vision together about what nature in the neighborhoods is going to be like. Well, now a year ago, Senator Cease said, all right, well, give me a tangible example. What would that be like? So I'm going to tell Ron, here's an example of this is what it's going to be like. This is how we're going to be working. And here are a couple of the examples of products that people are going to be seeing in their lives. One is this network. This without regard to who owns what. We own 8,500 acres. State Parks owns something. The city of Portland owns other things. Tualatin Hills Park and Rec District. What if we start managing those in concert with one another, looking at the different pots of money that we have and reinforcing what we're doing as part of a larger network in the way that our citizens enjoy those facilities? Well, having that type of committee and that type of dialogue and giving up our institutional egos and saying, all right, how do we each do what we do best? How's that going to work? We are going to be putting a bond measure on the ballot in November of 2006 in concert with those partners. It's not about our agency only. It's about the landscape and the environment and all of us working together on it. And I think that will be the type of approach that will get us the support. Let me give you a second example of something that maybe is a little farther away. And that has to do with an approach that we could take in the new city of Damascus, 25th city in the region. Beautiful place, 10,000 acres, and if you go out there on a day like today, you go up on the butte top shoots, Mount Hood is as if you can touch it. Yet there are also these deep canyons, Deep Creek, flowing into Kelly and the Johnson Creek system. Remarkable resources there. And if we approach them the way we'd been approaching them, they would be fragmented and disappear. Because strictly a regulatory approach to that would create winners and losers, depending on what you happen to own. And frankly, the losers wouldn't take it, certainly not with Measure 37 in effect. What if instead we recognized what they recognized in Sherwood, that those who are conserving some of the resource, the people next to it are actually going to benefit in appreciation of their property values, and sharing in that appreciation makes the whole place better. And so how do you get those property owners together and the city government to make that happen? I think it's a tremendous opportunity, but it does take that different way of doing things. So there's a couple of areas for us to think about. The economics, an area to think about, natural resources. I've been talking about those 2 areas. It means expanding wealth. I mean, it means expanding wealth in material sense of opportunities for kids to have jobs here, but also our personal wealth in terms of the enjoyment of living here. But I'm also talking about how we face those issues and how we solve them. To me, that is about regional governance. And it's no longer all about regional government. And I think that's the major breakthrough that we're talking about. We are blessed, I think, to have a regional government to deal with metropolitan issues of metropolitan concern. We have that institution, a regional government. But regional governance is really what we're striving for, those networks of people that actually make things happen. There are 2 types of power. There is authority and there's influence. And authority is something that's written down in statute books, and it's finite, and you can look it up. It's also something that can be jeopardized if you abuse it, and it's zero sum. Influence is not written down anywhere. It's something that you earn every day by your actions, and it's also something that multiplies the more that you use it and the more that you share it. I want to close with one example of something totally different that we are also doing along those exact same lines that perfectly illustrates the change of paradigm. And that's the issue of affordable housing. Very important issue for this region, and having access to affordable housing throughout the region is a metropolitan issue. 5 or 6 years ago, Metro undertook this in the old paradigm. The old paradigm was, well, gee whiz, got a problem? Lack of affordable housing? The answer is 7 people on the Metro Council adopt a functional plan which tells the local governments what to do, and says, well, Metro will keep records of it, and then a lot of other things just won't get done. Well, the problem with that is similar to the problem that I outlined before about 0 acres having been protected. How many housing units did that approach build? 1,000? 500? No, it built 0. 0 housing units were built through that approach. Now, with the council that we have, Councilor Rex Burkholder and Councilor Robert Liberty have designed a new approach to this. And let me tell you, this is part of the thrill of my day, is I get to wake up every day and go to work with people like Councilor Rex Burkholder and Councilor Robert Liberty. Believe me, going to work and talking about urban planning with people who are the best at what they do at it in the world is pretty remarkable things. I mean, this is going to talk every day with Rex Burkholder and Robert Liberty about urban planning. It's like going to talk to Britney Spears and Madonna about makeup. I mean, these are the best people. You're thinking, wow, they really know what they're doing. Well, they have been out 2 weeks ago. They're in a church basement or community center basement or something with a nonprofit organization in Lake Oswego, saying what is it going to take financially and in terms of political will and in terms of community support to actually produce some housing, and how can we connect you to Darlene Hooley's office to get you some of those federal funds that you didn't even know about. That's the role that Metro councilors can play, that actually produce things, making those connections, building political will, creating partnerships that will result in real things happening. Those are also the results of the reforms that we've been undertaking internally and externally. Those are tangible results of the types of things that are happening. We had been treating land use planning as a science, and it turns out, after all, it's really much more of an art. And it's more of an art because it involves people and dealing with their aspirations and their aspirations for the community. Brigham Young was actually one of the great urban planners of this country, little known fact, but 3 days after he came across the hill into what would become Salt Lake City, he started laying out the streets. And he said, and they repeat this in Salt Lake City, that good urban planning has 1 foot in memory and 1 foot in prophecy. And each year, my hour with you has a little of that as well. And so does my job every day of the year. And I'm very thankful for that and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, that was inspirational and provocative and forward-looking, and I feel like singing It's a Small World after all. But instead, we'll get to our question and answer period. And if you please be so good as to line up behind the microphones. The privilege of asking questions is reserved for City Club members only. Our board host today is Tamsin Wassell, who's been a member of the City Club since 1997 and has served on many research boards and research studies. And she is currently the first vice president of the Board of Governors and is the research board chair. She's a partner in RTS LLC, which is an organizational development firm specializing in risk, transition, and succession. Tamsin Wassell.
David, I too have to echo that one of the things I love about living in Portland is not just that green thing, but also the fact that we have such visionary, articulate, and thoughtful leaders in our community, and I do really appreciate that you're one of them. Thank you. I'll do a quick question because I can see, boy, the people are lining up for you. On the thought of economic prosperity, I'm going to link in the concept of education. And very recently, I heard a rumor that some parents groups are talking about approaching Metro to use its authority, its taxing authority, to provide supplemental financing for Metro area schools. I was wondering, first, do you think that that's possible? And second, if it is, what's your position on that?
I don't think it's a very likely prospect for success, actually, when given our mission and sort of where we rank in the consciousness of the public relative to people's allegiance to their own school districts. And the people I've talked to who know a lot about political polling would not say that having Metro be the standard bearer would help the cause of education in terms of ballot box. That's the wisdom among people who kind of work in the campaign world. I personally believe, I believe that personally from a tactical sense. I also believe it is the #1 economic issue. That's kind of the irony, you know, of all the discussion about what are we doing to nurture the high-tech cluster, and you know, and here Hillsborough having to close their schools 17 days early. Why even you know, why send the governor to Japan to go talk to any, I mean, who's going to come with that? Oh, Mr. Cox.
Mr. Bragdon, thank you. Are you,
You're always on my right, aren't you?
you're a member of City Club, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
Because we take credit cards. I'll run your card right back there if you want.
I thought libertarians didn't work on credit, Tom.
I'm just telling you, City Club membership is worth having, and you'd set a great example by joining today.
Thank you.
Mr. Bragdon, thank you for being here. We all know that the value of property arises from two sources in varying proportions, value in use and value in exchange. You have repeatedly expressed contempt for exchange value, calling it speculative, at least for real estate. Does your dismissive attitude extend to other forms of property, such as stocks, bonds, or future pension obligations, all of which can fairly be described as having exchange or speculative value? And if not, why not?
Well, have I been dismissive of stocks and bonds? Okay, let me try to answer seriously. I do think one of the issues that maybe the context of this came up in is when land appreciates, when we bring it into the urban growth boundary, and whether there ought to be some way for the appreciation of that, the capital gain on that, to be applied toward the public services needed to actually service the land. And I am supportive of that. I think that there's been a lot of debate in the last year about takings, not a whole lot of attention paid to givings, the fact that government services do lead to the appreciation of land, that if you can't get to a place and you can't have sewers and you can't have water, then any appraiser would tell you it's not as valuable as if you did. So one of the things that is being talked about in the legislature and that's been discussed in the past has been trying to capture some of that value on the capital gain. So I'm actually supportive of that.
Excellent. Now, I'll take your card back if you want me to.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mark Anderson, City Club member. I'm going to ask you a takings question. And Measure 37, you've mentioned it a couple of times. If people don't know about it, the website for the City Club has its own report on Measure 7, which was the precursor. Where is Metro on this, and specifically the patch quilt of rules and regulations that the jurisdictions within the Tri-County area, City of Beaverton isn't the same as Washington County, of which it is a part. Other counties and cities have their own rules. Is there any sense of Metro trying to help with that? And two, what happens to the urban growth boundary with the hundreds of claims that come in?
Let me address the first one. We're playing the role that I just outlined that we want to be playing more and more, which is to try to convene the different affected parties and share information. You're right, we have 25 different cities, each of them trying to struggle with this issue on their own. So we brought a group together. Mayor Judy Hammerstedt of Lake Oswego is chairing it for us. We have a couple of our counselors on it, but then we also have local government people, as well as people from the real estate industry or the conservation community or appraisal industry, banking industry, and all the people who have something to share on this topic to try to assess what some of those disparities are and try to come up with some way of dealing with things consistently across the region, particularly for some of the smaller jurisdictions. You know, if you're sitting there and you're mayor of Gladstone, you don't have a full-time attorney. You have maybe a couple people in your permit desk. But so dealing with these sorts of things at the local level is really a challenge for them. So the role we've been trying to play is that sort of technical advice and then come up with some policy solutions. We've also been participating. Senator Ringo is chairing Senate Environment and Land Use, been having some, I think, productive discussions around this issue. The interesting thing from the urban standpoint is most regulations, frankly, in the urban area enhance value in the sense that, you know, my house is actually worth more than it would be if there weren't zoning. So there are very few urban claims, in part for that reason. Also, there aren't that many directly us. We don't directly regulate property. We regulate local governments, and our role on this is sort of be their partnership, in partnership with them rather than make life worse for them. Your second question is, what does it happen to the urban growth boundary? It's potentially undermined to one degree or another, because most of the claims, while they're not in the metropolitan area, they are for development outside the metropolitan area that will suck life and infrastructure dollars and everything outside. And so we are also initiating a dialogue with the people who are going to be making those decisions, which under the law, I mean, they don't even have to tell us they're making those decisions, let alone tell the neighbor across the street they're making the decisions. And that is county commissioners in Columbia County or Yamhill County or Washington County for areas outside the urban growth boundary, or Clackamas County. And again, cities on the edge, Lake Oswego, Forest Grove, are very concerned with that as well. And so having some mechanism for discussion among those parties is going to be incredibly important, and having those interests represented in the legislature in terms of reforms that may need to come out of the legislature. Chris.
Hi, David. Chris Smith, City Club member. You've mentioned revitalized downtowns in Lake Oswego and Gresham. And in fact, the 2040 plan calls for a couple dozen regional and town centers, and unfortunately, they haven't all taken off to the extent that Lake Oswego and Gresham has. I think one of the lessons learned is you can't regulate town centers into existence. So what investments is Metro and should the region be looking at to make those centers a reality as we move forward?
I think it's a great question, and there's no question that the investment in those areas has been lagging relative to what we might have hoped 10 years ago, but that just proves you can't simply draw a picture and hope to have it happen. You actually have to have an investment climate, and you have to prime that with public investment. I think we've been having a series of events. The next one is next Thursday in Gresham, where there are some tremendous things happening there, and I mention that often. What they have in common is local political will and interest, and then some public investment in a civic amenity, whether it's the transportation access or often it's parks. It's often not necessarily wilderness area, but it's park, and that's been the case in both Gresham and in Lake Oswego, which I think are the two big success stories. So what we have been trying to do, again, in this role that I described earlier of Metro being a convener and sharing of technical information and how-to type stories, is having this series of events so that people who are getting started on this, and I find it very interesting that the Tigard City Council, a couple new members, relatively new mayor, they had a goal-setting session back in January. They said their #1 priority is the revitalization of downtown Tigard. So we said, well, how do we help you do that? It may be in part through some transportation improvements. It may be part in their thinking, and I hope I'm not giving anything away, is because this is going to be very exciting to people when they see it, is that Fano Creek flows right through downtown Tigard. Now, they now recognize that as not something that's over that back behind the parking lot, but that could be a centerpiece of a trail system as well as a nice place to go walking. So we're trying to work with jurisdictions like that